Did your family have favorites? If so, were you the favorite or someone else?
The laughter was sharp enough to slice through the air, but not quite sharp enough to cut the knot in my chest. My mother raised her glass with the confidence of someone who had rehearsed the line in her head all week, maybe longer, and she looked around the crowded dining room like a queen addressing her court. "To my favorite child," she said, pausing just long enough for every pair of eyes to swing toward my brother Daniel, the one who didn't disappoint. Her smirk was deliberate, her words sugar-coated in front of the cousins and uncles and neighbors who had been invited, but the venom was aimed directly at me. Chairs creaked as people leaned in, waiting for the punchline, and when the first laugh burst out, the rest followed like dominoes. I sat there with my fork in my hand, smiling too tightly, while heat rose up the back of my neck. If you grow up in a house where favoritism is as natural as breathing, you learn how to keep your face still. You laugh when everyone else laughs, you clap when you're expected to clap, and you train yourself not to flinch when your mother makes you the butt of her joke. I had been training for years, but that night was different. Maybe it was the way she tilted her head, as though she was daring me to react, or maybe it was the way Daniel's grin stretched across his face like he had finally won some lifelong competition. All I know is that my hand moved almost without thought, brushing against the folded envelope tucked deep inside my purse, and for the first time in years, I didn't swallow the bitterness. Birthdays in my family were never neutral ground. For Daniel, they were parades, cakes so big they leaned to one side, new bicycles wheeled into the room with ribbons tied around the handlebars, the kind of gifts that made neighbors whisper about how generous my parents were. For me, they were chores. Half-hearted candles on a store-bought cake, presents that felt more like obligations than celebrations, and the constant reminder that I was not the one worth bragging about. That contrast had built an entire lifetime of evidence stacked up against me, and it was always Daniel who came out looking like the golden one. When I left for college on a partial scholarship, my mother told everyone she was proud, but the words that slipped out to me in private were different. "Don't come back a failure, Rachel. I don't have the energy for another disappointment." I had carried that line with me like a stone in my pocket, heavy and smooth, worn down over time but never gone. And now, sitting in her dining room surrounded by people who were too polite to question her cruelty, I realized that stone was no longer just mine to carry. The envelope in my purse was addressed to me, but its contents belonged to Daniel. I had opened it the night before with trembling fingers, expecting something mundane, maybe even something boring, but what I found was neither. The words inside burned themselves into my brain, and as I folded it back up, I knew I had been given a weapon I had never asked for. The wine glasses clinked together, the laughter still echoing as if nothing had shifted, but my heart was pounding in a rhythm that no one else seemed to hear. I looked across the table at my mother, at the way she basked in her own cleverness, and I felt a strange calm settle over me. It wasn't the reckless kind of calm that makes you slam your hand on the table or scream until your throat aches. It was the steady kind, the kind that comes when you finally know you don't have to argue anymore, because the truth is already in your hands. Daniel leaned back in his chair, soaking in the attention, pretending to be embarrassed, but failing at it. I wondered if he could sense it too, the way the air was shifting, the way the ground under his chair was no longer solid. He had no idea that the shield he thought protected him had already cracked. For years, I had watched him glide through life, brushing off consequences that would have crushed anyone else, because my mother was always there to sweep up his mess before anyone noticed. But this time, the mess was too big to sweep. I placed my fork down carefully, aligning it with the edge of my plate as if precision could disguise the tremor in my hand. My pulse thudded in my ears, but my voice came out steady when I spoke. "Interesting toast," I said, and the chatter died down just enough for a few people to glance in my direction. "Funny thing, though. Something showed up yesterday." My mother's smile faltered, the faintest flicker, and I reached into my purse without rushing, pulling out the envelope as though it were nothing more than a bill. The room went quiet in stages, first the people closest to me noticing, then the ripple of silence spreading outward until even the children stopped whispering. My mother's eyes narrowed, her painted lips still curved upward but her jaw tense. I pushed my chair back, the scrape of wood against tile ringing louder than it should have, and I walked around the table with the envelope pinched between my fingers. My heels clicked against the floor, each step deliberate, each second dragging longer than the last. When I finally stood beside her chair, I didn't lean down, I didn't whisper, I didn't offer her the courtesy of privacy. Instead, I placed the envelope directly in her hand, the white paper stark against her manicured nails. "Since you're so proud of your favorite child," I said, the words tasting like iron on my tongue, "maybe you'll want to be the one to read this out loud." Her fingers trembled before she even broke the seal. I did not wake up that morning planning to become the curator of my family's favorite myth. I woke up planning to drop off dry cleaning, answer a few emails, and stop by the bakery for the lemon cake my mother pretends not to like and always finishes anyway. And yet by late afternoon I was standing in my apartment with a certified envelope balanced on my palm like a hot plate, listening to the mail carrier apologize for the delay while I signed my full name on the little gray screen and tried not to notice how my last name matched the one printed in bold on the upper left corner of a law firm I had only heard of in whispers at holiday dinners. The thing about an envelope with your name on it, stamped by a law office and sent overnight, is that it rearranges the air in the room before you even tear it open. It makes you stand still as if movement might trip some invisible alarm. And it forces you to count the reasons why a firm like that would bother with a person like you, none of which feel good, all of which taste like metal. I broke the seal anyway, because curiosity and dread are cousins that always travel together in my family, and I read the header twice before the sentence would hold still. Notice of intent, language about a guarantee I never signed. A payment plan that had slipped 3 cycles, a name that was not mine threaded through the paragraphs like dental floss gone wrong, and a closing line that cited inconsistencies between my signature on file with the state and the signature attached to a very confident promissory note. By the time the words resolved into meaning, my coffee had cooled into something thin and bitter, and I had to sit down with the envelope on my knee while my heart made that jumpy rhythm people mistake for excitement when really it is the body counting exits. Because underneath the legalese the story was plain. Daniel had built another paper castle, and to keep it upright he had leaned a wall against my name, a neat little forgery that anyone who had ever watched me sign a lease could have spotted. And whether he told himself it was temporary or harmless, whether he convinced himself that success was just one more extension away, did not change the fact that my name was the ladder he had dragged across a fence that was not his. There are clean ways to handle a thing like that, and there are honest ways, and most of the time they are not the same. So I called the number at the bottom of the letter and spoke to a paralegal with a voice like a stainless steel sink. And I said I had not signed any guarantee for any line of credit, and I would be happy to provide a copy of my identification and a sample signature, and I listened to her type and clear her throat and say that their client, a lender with a very polished website, would appreciate my prompt documentation, and I said I would email it within the hour, which I did, along with a polite question about whether the lender planned to notify the primary borrower that the guarantor they were leaning on had stepped off the beam. When her reply arrived, brisk and careful, I stared at the phrase preliminary review and felt the strange calm that follows the first wave of fear, the one that knocks you off your feet and then recedes just long enough for you to see the pattern of the sand. And it was in that careful quiet that a thought settled so neatly I almost laughed, because for years my mother had made sure that any mess with Daniel's name on it was folded into a story about grit and misunderstood genius, a glossy narrative with no receipts, and now I had actual receipts, and not only could I refuse to be drafted into the cover-up, I could decline the role with style. So I did something that would have made my younger self blush and my older self proud. I walked to the print shop on the corner and copied the first page of the letter, blurring the account numbers because I still believe in not burning the house down when opening a window will do, and I slid each copy into a plain white envelope with no markings, the kind party hosts use for icebreaker games that make people confess their most embarrassing stories, and I tucked those envelopes into my tote bag. With the lemon cake order slip and the vintage corkscrew my mother pretends is hers and always forgets on my counter. At the restaurant, I arrived early, not to sabotage the centerpiece my aunt had arranged with hydrangeas and a ribbon the exact pink of my mother's lipstick, but to slide an envelope under each dinner plate where the linen hung just low enough to hide the edge. And when the servers fussed with the cutlery, I smiled and thanked them and asked, with the casual cheerfulness of a bridesmaid who knows where the good champagne is hidden, whether the projector for the birthday slideshow would be set up by dessert, which it would, and I nodded as if a slideshow of my mother's childhood was the only planned spectacle of the night. By the time my mother lifted her glass and delivered her line with that little theater kid pause she never outgrew, my plan was no longer a plan but a fuse already lit. And when I stood and crossed the room with the original envelope in my hand, I felt the huddle of attention gather around me like fabric, heavy and warm, and I knew that whatever happened next would not be contained to our family group chat. Her fingers trembled, the seal cracked, her eyes skated across the first paragraph, and then snagged on the sentence that knew her son better than she ever had, and before she could decide whether to swallow the words or spit them back at me, I lifted my glass and said that since we were playing favorites tonight, we should play fair, and that under each plate there was a party favor to open on the count of 3. She froze. Daniel blinked like a man facing a sudden light, and the room, obedient as always, reached down in a rustle of linen and silverware, and when 3 arrived not as a shout but as a steady count in my voice. 20 pairs of hands lifted 20 envelopes and 20 sets of eyes fell on 20 copies of an introduction that did not need the final pages to make its point. And while the silence pulled tight as wire, I turned toward the projector cart and handed the waiter a thumb drive. Labeled family photos that did not contain a single baby picture, only a brief screen of text that said, as gently as a hammer, that signatures have personalities and mine had never met the one used to borrow money in my name. And as the first line appeared 10 feet wide above the cake, the favor my mother always saves for her golden child melted into a quiet that tasted a lot like justice. The first sound to return to the room was not a gasp or an apology or even my mother's sharp intake of breath as her eyes tried to outrun the meaning on the screen. It was the clatter of a butter knife tipping off a bread plate and skittering across the tiled floor like a nervous silver fish, and that tiny unplanned noise, that reminder that gravity still had rules in a night where everything else was slipping, seemed to give everyone permission to move again, though what they moved toward was less comfort than confrontation, because my Aunt June reached for her envelope with fingers that wanted to be gentle and failed. My cousin Tyler read the first paragraph twice and then looked up at me with a face that mixed sympathy with the inconvenient thrill of drama, and the neighbor from down the block, who had come for cake and a safe story to tell later, pressed her lips together in the way people do when the gossip is too fresh to swallow. Daniel, who had never liked being surprised unless he was the one holding the confetti, tried to find his footing with a laugh that did not have a landing, a sound that started in his throat and died there when the projector advanced to the side-by-side signatures. The neat loops of my actual name next to the blocky impersonation he had sworn to himself no one would ever notice, and for a second I almost pitied the way his shoulders folded inward as if he could hide inside a jacket that had never fit him, but pity is an expensive indulgence in a room full of receipts, and mine had already been paid for an interest. My mother, who has always believed that control is mostly about tone and posture, straightened in her chair and cleared her throat as if clearing a stage, and she began with the kind of line she keeps in a glass case for family emergencies. There must be some misunderstanding. Anyone can make a mistake. This is a private matter we will handle quietly, except the words sounded like they were walking on broken glass, and the room, which had spent a lifetime nodding along with her preferred version of events, did not rush to prop her up, because even the people who loved her most could see the ink, the dates, the language about default and guarantee and verification. And they could hear the way the paralegals' reply on the screen used phrases like preliminary review and material discrepancy, which are not the vocabulary of misunderstandings but of consequences. If the evening had been a stage play, this would have been the scene where the lead actress improvises past the point of credibility, because she turned toward me with eyes that glinted like polished steel and asked, in a voice that kept trying to be warm and failing, why I would choose her birthday to humiliate my brother, and whether I had considered, even for a second, what this spectacle would do to our reputation, and whether there had been a kinder way to address my concerns, and for once. I did not let the guilt bait me into apology. I did not start explaining that a kinder way had been available to Daniel every single time he chose not to forge my name. Because I had gone quiet in too many rooms while other people's comfort was treated like a sacred object, and I was done patting the edges of a truth that cut. Daniel tried a different door, the one labeled charm and nostalgia, and he launched into a story about the time he co-signed a car for a friend who left him holding the bag. A cautionary tale meant to paint him as a victim of loyalty rather than an architect of shortcuts, but even his old allies had trouble meeting him in that fiction, while the projector displayed the part of the letter that referenced the application metadata. The timestamp aligned to a weekday morning when I had been in a meeting across town, and he had been, as his location-tagged photos later confirmed, within walking distance of the lender's branch, and the quiet cough that rose from the back table. My uncle, an accountant who hoards facts like pennies, told me the tide had turned from indulgence to accounting. What I had not predicted, even in my most self-satisfied rehearsal, was the way the room would divide not into Team Rachel and Team Daniel, but into the blurrier lanes of people evaluating their own risk, because a secret like this functions like a mirror. And you could watch the married couple at the end of the table calculate whether their credit score might have a surprise bruise. You could see my mother's closest friend adding up the not-quite-explained favors she had done for Daniel over the years, and you could feel the subtle shift as the question moved from whether I had been too dramatic to whether they had all been too trusting. A pivot that always tastes like betrayal when you realize the person you defended could not be bothered to defend you in return. I told myself to speak only once and say what mattered, so I took the microphone the restaurant had provided for sentimental toasts, and I said, in a voice that refused to wobble, that I would be filing a formal fraud report in the morning and forwarding the documentation to the lender's compliance department as well as to the bureau that polices this exact sort of mess, and that I had already placed a freeze on my credit, so any further acrobatics would require more effort than my brother had historically invested in honesty, and I added that I would be happy to share the contact details with any guest who wanted to protect themselves. Then I thanked the staff for the lemon cake that deserved a better evening and handed the microphone to the manager before my mother could yank it from my hand, because even revenge benefits from good stagecraft. The clever part, the part that made a few jaws set in that familiar combination of admiration and disapproval, arrived not with a scream, but with a signature of my own, because while the projector cooled and hands drifted off envelopes, the servers wheeled out a tray of white boxes tied with twine that I had prepaid that morning, and inside each box, nestled next to a slice of cake, was a copy of a simple document stamped with the words Identity Protection Checklist, a gift card for a credit monitoring service I had negotiated at a group rate, and a small printed note that read, in lines too calm to be petty, that while I could not rewind the choices that brought us here, I could make sure that no one else left this room unprepared. Which meant that even those who thought my method harsh would have to credit the outcome, and as the lids lifted and the whisper of paper filled the space where my mother's power used to live, Daniel's phone lit up with a text from a number he could not ignore, and his face emptied in that unmistakable way people wear when the story they wrote for themselves has been revised without their consent. The text that lit up Daniel's screen while the projector cooled and the room rehearsed its shock had not come from a friend with a spare alibi or a bartender with a back door. It had come from a compliance officer whose signature block included a direct line, an extension, and a note about recorded calls for training purposes, and although I could not hear the words from where I stood, the way Daniel's shoulders slipped an inch and the way his thumb hovered over the glass told me that whatever version of the story he had prepared for a forgiving audience would have to be rewritten for a desk that kept copies of everything, because this was no longer about saving face in front of relatives who had always found him charming. This was about answering questions that arrived with timestamps and file hashes and a patience that outlasted tantrums. I stepped into the corridor that runs behind the private dining room, the one with the framed photographs of people who had celebrated retirements and reunions in this same space under lights that flatter everyone. And I listened to my voicemail because the persistent buzz I had ignored during cake had earned attention, and there it was, a message from a notary public investigator with a voice like a librarian who knows exactly where the missing volume went, explaining that a complaint had triggered a routine verification of a stamp used on certain loan documents, that the notary's journal contained an entry matching my alleged appearance on a weekday morning when my calendar had me across town sitting through a presentation about budget forecasts and stale pastries, and that the investigator would appreciate any documentation I could provide to establish that the signature attributed to me belonged to someone who did not pronounce my name correctly even when writing it. The corridor smelled faintly of lemon oil and the kind of soap that restaurants use when they want people to remember cleanliness without noticing bleach, and as I stood there with the message replaying in tight loops, the night rearranged itself in my head with an inevitability that made my teeth ache, because the forgery had been sloppy in the way shortcuts are sloppy, but it had not been blind, and blind is not how Daniel operates when the prize is within reach. Which meant that somewhere along the line he had gotten his hands on a clean scan of my identification, the same high-resolution file I had created 2 summers ago when my mother asked me to digitize our family records so the insurance agent could keep everything in one place. A little favor that justified her habit of treating my weekends like a laundromat for other people's errands, and if that file had landed in the folder Daniel considered his personal buffet, the line from spreadsheet to signature would not look like a leap so much as a step he had convinced himself the universe owed him. When I returned to the room, the party had bent into clusters of damage control, little circles where people attempted to reassemble the old hierarchy out of new facts, and my mother, who has always believed that dignity can be reclaimed by speaking as if she were already believed, had positioned herself near the head of the table with her chin lifted and her pearls sitting obediently on her collarbone. And in a voice that reached for grace, she said there would be a family discussion in private. That we were not the kind of people who aired grievances in public, that kindness would guide our next steps, and every sentence sounded like a prayer read from a card found in a drawer, which is to say rehearsed and remote from the blood on the floor. I did not argue about the definition of public. I did not list the times kindness had been a one-way street paved over my name, and I did not ask whether she had noticed what the projector had made impossible to ignore, because this was the moment to decide whether justice needed a flourish, and I had already arranged for one that was less theatrical than efficient. So when the restaurant doors opened and a man in a dark blazer stepped in with a folder under his arm and the calm of someone performing a routine he could do in his sleep, I felt the room inhale as if the oxygen had new rules, because nothing punctuates a speech about privacy quite like a process server saying a name clearly enough for 3 generations to flinch, then placing a packet titled Notice of Civil Action into the hands that have been skipping consequences since high school. Daniel stared at the packet as if it might evaporate under heat. My mother said my full name in the way mothers do when they are counting the cost of you and the cost of losing you. And I kept my voice steady as I explained that I had filed the fraud affidavit that morning once the firm confirmed reception of my documentation, that the lender's counsel had acknowledged the discrepancy and transferred the matter to their recovery team with instructions that might finally teach my brother the difference between a family bailout and a real deadline, and that I had also logged a report with the notary regulator and the credit bureaus, because while forgiveness is a virtue in stories, in the real world the only thing that stops a thief with a pen is a lock that bites back. The twist arrived not with a second server, but with a second envelope, smaller and heavier, addressed to my mother in a handwriting I recognized from files stamped by our family attorney, a man who has spent years treating my mother's impulses like a puzzle to be solved with paperwork. And when she slid it open with the edge of a dessert knife and unfolded a letter about a home equity line that had been extended beyond prudent ratios based on misstatements later tied to external documents, my name among them, the color drained from her voice even as she kept speaking, because the tidy rule she has lived by, that Daniel's risks were brilliant and my caution was cowardice, no longer mapped onto a house that had become a collateral-heavy shrine to denial. I wanted to be gentle, I really did, but gentleness is not a rope strong enough to pull a family out of a hole it keeps digging. So I delivered the piece of revenge that tasted least like vengeance and most like relief. Announcing that earlier in the afternoon I had walked into the credit union where my mother still enjoys the halo of her decades-old account, that I had exercised the limited power of attorney she had insisted I sign for medical emergencies. The one she swore would never be used for money, to file a narrow revocation specific to financial endorsements bearing my name, and that I had simultaneously requested, on her behalf and with the manager present, a temporary freeze and audit of the home equity line activity pending verification of signatures, which meant that until the ink could stand on its own legs, not one more dollar would leak through the crack Daniel had carved with his favorite tool. And while my mother searched my face for the betrayal she wanted to pin on me, the truth she found instead was worse, because it looked a lot like love that had finally decided to stop participating in its own erasure. The house was quieter than I had expected the next morning, though perhaps quiet was not the right word, because silence in a family like mine is never true absence of sound, but rather a density of unsaid things pressing against the walls until they creak. I walked down the hall with my coffee cooling too quickly in its mug, the same hall where photographs had been arranged for decades to remind visitors of a family mythology that no longer had an audience willing to applaud. And I paused in front of the framed graduation picture that my mother loved to use as Exhibit A for Daniel's brilliance, a photograph that captured the curve of his smile, but never the trail of unpaid bills, borrowed credit, or clever signatures he left behind him like breadcrumbs. I let myself stare at it longer than usual, and I wondered whether he had ever understood how much energy it takes to construct a reputation strong enough to withstand evidence to the contrary. In the dining room, the remnants of the birthday celebration still lingered, a wilted centerpiece with ribbon slipping loose, half-empty glasses lined up like soldiers abandoned on the battlefield, and a scattering of envelopes that some relatives had folded neatly into their purses while others had left open in visible defiance, as if refusing to carry the weight of Daniel's truth would make it less true. My mother sat at the table with her pearls still on, as though armor would shield her from the cracks that had spread too quickly to patch, and she looked at me with the kind of expression that has no single word to define it, part grief, part fury, part calculation, and I understood that she was not deciding whether to forgive me, but rather deciding which version of the story she would tell herself in order to keep functioning. Daniel had not come home, though his absence did not stop his presence from filling the air, because my mother kept her phone beside her as though his voice might still rescue the evening if only he said the right combination of words. The text message he had received during the party had multiplied into a chain of follow-ups, each stamped with formal language that brooked no compromise, and by now he would know that the performance of charisma had no exchange rate in a place where numbers have to balance. I imagined him sitting in his car, scrolling through the notices, swearing under his breath and promising himself that the world would forgive him once more, though for the first time I doubted whether he believed his own script. When my mother finally spoke, her voice was lower, stripped of its stagecraft, and she asked me whether I had considered what this would do to the family's reputation, as though the echo of laughter from cousins and neighbors carried more permanence than the black-and-white truth of notarized records. I answered slowly, choosing words not because I wanted to spare her but because I wanted to spare myself from sounding triumphant, and I told her that reputation is only worth what it costs to maintain, and that I was finished paying into a system where my silence was the only currency accepted. She looked down at her hands, fingers still trembling faintly, and I realized that in her mind my betrayal was not in exposing Daniel, but in refusing to play the role she had written for me decades ago, the daughter who swallowed insult, the sister who stood in shadow. The relatives began calling before noon, some offering clipped advice about letting things cool, others fishing for details they had missed when the projector had made its grand debut, and still others cautiously thanking me for giving them permission to doubt the golden boy who had borrowed not only money, but also goodwill from them in amounts they had never dared to count. Each call felt like a small referendum, a test of whether my decision had been justified, but I reminded myself that justice is not measured by applause, it is measured by whether the truth stands even when people stop clapping. That evening, when the house was empty again, I sat at the table where the toast had been made, where the laughter had rung too loudly, and I unfolded the original letter once more, letting my eyes trace the sentences that had lit the fuse. It no longer made me shake, but neither did it make me proud. It felt like holding a shard of glass, proof of impact, proof of fracture, proof of danger. I thought about my brother somewhere out there rehearsing his new excuses, my mother upstairs rehearsing her new story, and me rehearsing nothing at all, because for the first time I did not need rehearsal. The ending I had delivered was clean enough to satisfy an audience, but messy enough to leave scars, and I realized that revenge, even when clever, does not restore what was taken. It only shifts the balance of who carries the weight. As I set the letter back into its envelope and slid it across the table, I whispered words no one else would hear, that I had not wanted to win, I had only wanted to stop losing. And in that moment I understood that the silence which followed would not be peace, it would be consequence, and consequence is never neat, never polite, and never entirely finished. So when people later asked me whether I regretted what I had done, I did not offer a speech or an apology. I told them the only thing I knew to be true, that families are built on stories, and when you finally refuse to play your assigned part, the story does not end, it simply becomes something no one can control. And maybe, just maybe, that was the most honest ending of all.